Chapter 1. My First Coast-to-Coast Flight. In Georgia, the winter of 1968 had been brutal, one of the coldest in decades. I heard on the radio the other day that we are in for a new ice age. As cold as it was, I believed the prediction. Preferring warmth, I just hoped the glaciers wouldn't arrive during my lifetime. When Valerie, my wife of 2 years, dropped me off at Hartsfield International Airport in Atlanta for my early morning flight on January 30th, I felt the stinging wind cut through my lightweight wool coat. It was like I wasn't wearing anything warmer than a t-shirt. The chill was so penetrating, Val didn't even get out of the car to kiss me goodbye, which didn't bother me in the slightest. Instead, she chose to embrace me while enjoying the warmth of our Chevy Impala. Smart girl. Grabbing my suitcase, as the wind continued to cut through me, I felt the coldness down to my bones. This made me pick up speed. By the time I reached the terminal, I was practically sprinting to get inside, just like everybody else. Although I had flown a couple of times before when I was a teenager, this was my first coast-to-coast trip. As you can imagine, I was very excited about making the journey. Flying to Los Angeles, along with a helicopter ride to San Bernardino, followed by a long drive escalating up the mountainside to Lake Arrowhead, was a gruesome ordeal, and it was very expensive. The price to fly was more than 2 monthly house payments, which made the decision to make the trip a significant one. Nevertheless, both Val and I thought it was worth the financial sacrifice and the unscheduled time off from work. It wasn't like we were broke, not like most of our friends were anyway. Since my dad had recently died, leaving me with $50,000 in cash as part of my inheritance, Val and I definitely weren't penniless. This was quite a bit of money in those days. It actually had the purchasing power that $325,000 currently has. It was a lot of money for a couple in their mid-20s. Wanting to be wise with the funds, we used $30,000 to purchase a house valued at $45,000, leaving us with a significant discretionary income and a manageable mortgage. My dad's wise planning had set us up for life, and I was very grateful for his generosity. So was Val, although she never got to know him very well before his passing. I'm a high school social studies teacher, by the way, teaching comparative government between the United States and the Soviet Union. I also teach a class in Russian history, which I've always found to be more interesting than American, British, or French history. Once you learn to pronounce Russian names, that is. I've been teaching for a couple of years. I enjoy it, sort of. But it isn't what I intended to do with my life. In fact, I never wanted to teach at all. It was my backup plan. Nothing more. To make the trip, I was forced to take 3 personal days from school, wrapped around a weekend. It was a quick turnaround, but having used all of my absences due to a bout with strep throat earlier in the school year, I couldn't afford to miss another day off from work. I had a good teaching job, paying $6,900 a year, up from $6,300 the previous year. My California adventure was certain to be grueling, but being young and energetic, I was eager to participate in the conclave with my ex-Crusade friends, the ministry friends I had worked with several years earlier. It was being held at a mansion adjacent to Lake Arrowhead, high in the San Bernardino Mountains. After leaving Crusade because of an unfortunate rift between our faction of the ministry and its founder, nearly everybody in our crowd felt spiritually adrift. We needed a vision, as well as a new direction for our lives. The Lake Arrowhead weekend, featuring messages from ex-staff members including my spiritual mentor, Jonathan Turlock, was billed to be just what we needed. I was really looking forward to hearing what he had to say. When I arrived in the late afternoon and saw the attendees, it seemed like a who's who from the Ministry of Believers crusade. Nearly everybody of stature was present, other than the ministry's founder. To be invited was quite an honor, especially because of my age. At 24, I was the youngest person by close to a decade. Nevertheless, I was the only one who considered my youth to be important. Nobody else gave it a second thought. What was significant was our need to find a new sense of purpose. Our original goal became irrelevant the day we left Crusade. This was true for all of us, and it was obvious. It seemed to be the topic of conversation in nearly every discussion. I felt particularly aimless. No longer having an altruistic goal for my life, I was floundering. I wanted to make history, not teach it. Val was genuinely concerned about me, but she felt equally adrift, which is why she encouraged me to take the trip. Being as goal-oriented as I was, we both needed a new direction to replace the one we discarded. I grew up in Midlothian, Texas, by the way, just south of Dallas, the only child in a strong Christian family. My dad, being a prominent banker and a Southern Baptist deacon, wanted the best education possible for me, so he sent me to Baylor University in Waco. It was the only school to which I made application. To attend any other university was never a consideration, not as long as he was the head of house and footing the bills. Because it was his alma mater, Baylor was the school I was expected to attend from the time I was a little boy. This didn't bother me, though, nor did I consider submitting to his decision to be an imposition, at least not after I made my first visit to the campus as a junior in high school. Baylor was a great school, had a beautiful campus, situated adjacent to the Brazos River, solid academics, small-town values, and a wonderful reputation. By going to Baylor, my dad also believed I wouldn't stray too far from the paths of righteousness, which proved to be a fairly accurate assessment. None of this is what sold me on attending Baylor, though. Although I kept it to myself for obvious reasons, what I liked best about the university were the co-eds. Baylor had the prettiest girls in Texas, including the girls on the campuses at Southern Methodist, the University of Texas, and Texas Christian. From the moment I saw my first group of girls walking toward the cafeteria on my initial visit, I was a Baylor Bear through and through. I couldn't wait to matriculate. Nearly as important, Baylor was part of the Southwest Conference, where the best football in America was played, with a respectful nod to Southern Cal, the Crimson Tide, Nebraska, and Notre Dame. Although our conference was dominated by Texas and Arkansas, it was exciting to be at the heart of an all-American tradition. I loved everything about the Southwest Conference, except for the Texas A&M Aggies, of course. They are the most obnoxious football fans west of the Mississippi. Constantly spewing their 12th man nonsense, they repulsed normal football fans from schools like mine. It seemed like every Aggie was a George Patton wannabe, especially when the movie came out heralding the General's World War II heroics a few years later. My dad, having served in the Third Army during World War II, Patton's army, was no fan of old blood and guts, nor were any of his soldier buddies. That the Aggies adopted the Patton mystique was really irritating, especially to my father. From my first day at Baylor, I felt right at home. During my junior year, pursuing a dual major in political science and European history, I traveled to Oxford, Mississippi for a basketball tournament with my best friend, Meyer Jones. Having just finished midterms, we both needed a break, which we thought the tournament would provide. Desiring nothing more than a mindless diversion from our academics, I gained a lot more from the trip than I expected. This is where I met my future wife, Valerie Jean Garrett. Despite being around beautiful young women at Baylor constantly, the instant I saw Val, I knew she was the girl for me. I was awestruck, completely smitten. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen, which is saying something coming from Texas. Having spent 3 years at Baylor, I had become quite a connoisseur at appraising the beauty of co-eds, just like every other guy at the university. Val had auburn hair that was thick and so dark it could accurately be described as raven. The shade was completely natural, without highlight, which was very popular during that period. Even better, she wore it long, which beautifully accentuated her nearly perfect figure. Just over 5'5", her eyes were emerald green and her complexion was flawless, which was also rare in those days. An avid tennis player, her legs were well tanned and athletic, perfectly proportioned to her thin waist and modest breasts. If I were to use one word to describe my first impression of Val, that word would have been mesmerizing. That she was wearing an engagement ring gave me momentary pause, but I was already committed to pursuing this beautiful young lady. When I first spotted her, I was walking with Mayer. We were headed to downtown Oxford to get a bite to eat before the next basketball game, but I never made it to the hamburger joint. Not once I saw Val. I actually forgot about being hungry, which was rare for me, just like it would be for any 20-year-old guy. The moment my eyes met hers, I actually stopped dead in my tracks, oblivious to how foolish this must have made me appear. My abrupt halt surprised Meyer, who was clueless about what had just transpired. My behavior didn't surprise Val, though. Having spotted me, she knew exactly what was going through my mind. Smiling coquettishly in response to my vaudevillian gawk, it was obvious she was flattered. I hoped she was also pleased, because she didn't turn her head away from me dismissively. My concern about her diamond ring dissipated somewhat, but I was worried she might already be taken. I actually said an inaudible prayer, asking God to make her available, a prayer I was certain He would honor. Casting caution to the wind, I turned to Meyer and told him to walk ahead, assuring him I would catch up soon. This confused him at first, but then he spotted Val. When he did, he understood what had happened instantly. Good wingmen always do, and Meyer was one of the best. Without saying another word, he simply walked off, sporting a knowing, semi-lewd smirk, which I hoped didn't offend the beautiful Ole Miss co-ed. Seizing the moment, I walked up to her and introduced myself. As I did, the wind rustled for just an instant, and I caught her scent, which was enchanting. I was enthralled, no question about it, and I hoped she might be too. I think she liked my self-confidence, and I knew exactly what I wanted from the moment I met her, never deviating from my initial interest one iota. Most girls like guys who are like this, and I suspected Val was one of them. After our first introduction, we walked to a nearby park bench to talk. Once we sat down, she told me quite a bit about herself. I cherished every word she said, and dedicated each fact to memory. I didn't expect her to be as open as she was, but I certainly liked her transparency. It meant she trusted me intuitively, a feeling I fully reciprocated. She was a junior at Ole Miss, where her beauty was actually commonplace. In nearly every other setting in America, she would have stood out from all of her peers, including Baylor, but not at Ole Miss, where an unattractive woman was the exception rather than the rule. Having watched Bert Parks host the Miss America pageant for years, I was amazed that nearly every year one of the finalists seemed to come from Ole Miss. Now, having been on the Oxford campus for just one day, I finally understood the reason. Val came from Livingston, Alabama, where her father had been in the timber business before dying from a work-related accident. Val was in 6th grade at the time. After his death, hard times fell upon the family. Val had wanted to go to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, but her grades weren't quite good enough. At Ole Miss, however, where the academic standards were substantially lower, she was accepted easily and became an academic standout. After telling me numerous stories about her life, while also asking questions about mine, she finally held up her left hand and said, "I suppose you've noticed this." "As big as it is, it would be hard to miss," I answered playfully. Laughing at my response, she became serious a moment later. Looking at me, she announced, "It's what you think it is. I'm engaged." "Okay," I replied, anxious for her to continue. Sighing, she looked off for quite a while, as the lull of our conversation intensified my apprehension. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, but was actually less than a minute, she looked at me straight in the eye and said, "His name is Charles Roderick Appleyard III, but everybody calls him Charlie. We've been engaged for a little more than a year. This is his final semester of law school. Because he's graduating, everybody expects us to get married very soon." "Before you graduate?" I asked. "Marrying well is the degree most girls at Ole Miss want," she responded matter-of-factly, as if she had answered my question. I'm not certain why, but this surprised me. Then she sighed, and her shoulders slumped, either from relief at having been straightforward or from resignation to her fate. I couldn't tell which. Perhaps there was an entirely different explanation. Not knowing how to respond, I simply kept my mouth shut and waited patiently for her to continue. After a long pause, she did. Fixing her gaze squarely on me with obvious sadness in her eyes, she said, "Given my situation, marrying Charlie is a good decision." Measuring my response, I finally asked, "But is marrying him what you want for your life?" She didn't answer. Instead, she winced, just a little, stiffening as she did. Turning her head away from me again, she looked off toward the west. I assumed she was thinking about how to respond, but she never did. She became emotional instead. A moment later, a solitary tear rolled down her face, followed by another a few seconds later. Better than any words ever could, her tears answered my question. Although I had been with her for just a few minutes, I felt like I had known her my entire life. People who have had the experience of falling in love instantly understand what this means. Those who haven't never could. Acting impulsively, I drew her to me and held her tight. When I did, she didn't resist my embrace. Instead, she welcomed it. With her pent-up emotions finally getting the best of her, she cried on my shoulder, holding me very close, tightening her grip, bonding us together. After crying for quite some time, dampening the right shoulder of my Izod, she took a Kleenex from her purse, blew her nose, and dried her eyes. Although she had cried copiously, this didn't diminish her beauty. Not one bit. In fact, when she pulled a few inches away from me and looked up, her smile was sultry, stirring to me. Refusing to act impulsively, despite wanting to kiss her, I simply returned her smile and waited for what would come next. I didn't have to wait long. She informed me she had a date with Charlie that evening, but she intended to break it to spend some more time with me, if that was what I wanted. Her response was both surprising and flattering. It certainly was what I wanted, and I told her so. Smiling coquettishly while taking my hand, she said, "Come with me." Leading me deeper into the park, she stepped behind a tree. Then she let go of my hand and put both of her arms around my neck. Drawing me near, she kissed me. It was a kiss like nothing I had ever experienced. All young guys consider themselves to be experienced. That's a given. But I wasn't. Not really. So when she kissed me like she did, it scared me a little. But it also drew me in. I liked it. I liked it a lot. And I wanted more of it. A lot more.